The global and domestic economies have changed significantly from when the last budget was announced in October last year in terms of the global and Malaysian inflationary landscape, among others. With just a week before Prime Minister and Finance Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim tables the 2023 budget, it will certainly focus on cost of living issues. But what else should we see in the federal government's national spending plan for this year? A budget for the people, for businesses, and one that mobilises revenues in the best way. I'm Muhammed Ahmad Hamdan, and this is Money Matters. Hello there and welcome to another episode of Money Matters. The 2023 budget is expected to be based on the current global and domestic state of affairs. It is also the first for the unity government under the leadership of Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, and it is due to this that the people will want to see what will be contained in the budget this time around, as there is tremendous expectation of an economic slowdown around the globe. I want to discuss this with Economist Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams, who is also a non-resident senior fellow of the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, MIER. Welcome to the program. Hi. Once again, Professor.
Thanks.
It's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
Pleasure to come every time.
Great. Now, Professor, let's start off with the Auditor General's report, which was issued last Thursday, in which it was revealed that non-compliance had resulted in losses of nearly 160 million ringgit in public funds. Now, while we're looking at allocations set aside in the annual national budgets, we're also having to deal with, this wastage in public funds. What could be the most effective approach to tackle this situation so that we don't have to hear about it anymore? It's something that we hear every day.
Well, it is, but it's also a timely reminder, isn't it, that quite a lot of money is going it's just not being allocated in the way that it should be allocated. This is actually a relatively small amount. 260 million sounds a large amount.
Correct.
But this was actually a relatively small audit. If you did the audit across the whole of the government, you could save a great deal of money simply by improving procurement, improving allocations, improving the way that it's spent, improving the auditing. So the problem is that the auditing at the moment happens afterwards. It doesn't happen at the beginning. So there needs to be a tightening up of the whole procedures. But of course, as you mentioned, we hear this time and time and time again. But I think Datuk Seri Anwar has been very, very firm on this, and he has highlighted this as one of the key ways of improving, if not improving the total revenues, certainly making those revenues go further in terms of spending. Wastage is a very key issue for him.
Now, you've mentioned before, 160 million may seem small vis-a-vis the whole budget allocation, which is in a range of billions, hundreds of billions of ringgit. It's true, but at the end of the day, it's still taxpayers' money, and that money could have been channeled to, supporting the welfare of the people. I also want to touch on subsidies, speaking of which. Malaysia's subsidy budget hit an all-time high of nearly 80 billion ringgit in 2022. Now, how worrying is this for you as an economist?
If it were to continue, it would be worrying.
Okay.
But we have to remember that the biggest chunk of the subsidies was in petrol subsidies. And that's because petrol prices in the middle of last year were up around $120 or $130 a barrel. Now they've come down to about somewhere between $80 and $90 a barrel. We're moving up a little bit.
Is that a comfortable level, though?
Well, whether it's comfortable or not, that's the level we have to take, because Malaysia doesn't set the rate.
Sure. Yeah.
But Malaysia benefits from it. I mean, when the price was high, Malaysia was making a lot of revenue. And so this is why the subsidy bill very large, but also not so bad here, because the big chunk of it was the petrol subsidies, and that was also being paid because there was higher revenues. So even last year we saw that the revenue from Petronas increased almost twice to what it was, and that's a big source of revenue for the government. The downside, of course, is that it was used for subsidies and it wasn't used for allocations across health and education and social welfare. So if these subsidies remained high, yes, that would be a problem. And it would continue to be a problem. But we expect that certainly the petrol subsidies will now come down because the price is coming down. But then the government needs to look at some of the other subsidies. The electricity subsidies have been frozen. The tariff was frozen. That might have to change in the future, but for the moment it's still there. And then some of the subsidies on food might have to be looked at again.
How do you suggest subsidy concerning food to be revised?
It's very difficult. We've heard a lot about what we call targeted subsidies. Now, in my view, it's not possible to target subsidies. If we, let's say we look at cooking oil, for example.
Sure.
So if we subsidize that and keep the price down, anybody can buy it. It doesn't matter what is your income. You could be T20 or B40, it doesn't matter, or even B20, it doesn't matter. Anyone can buy that. So if you fix the price, it's very difficult to target on particular groups. So we were subsidizing and also controlling prices because of the inflation problem. So because the inflation problem will ease during this year, we need to look at different ways of addressing the cost of living. The problem with inflation is the prices have gone up, and even if the inflation starts to slow down, the prices won't come down. They will remain high. So the cost of living still continues to be a problem for many people, particularly those on lower incomes. So the targeting has to move to the targeting of their income. So we saw the assistance scheme, the Bantuan scheme, was brought forward to January. It was paid in January. It cost 1.67 billion ringgit. If that was paid every month, it would, over the period of 12 months, it would only cost about 20 billion, which is only a quarter of what they spent last year on subsidies. Last year, 80 billion. And if they switch that to an income subsidy, a targeted income subsidy, it would cost about a quarter of what the price subsidies would cost.
Speaking of this, there have been recalls by many quarters for subsidy reforms in this country. How do you think that is best done for Malaysia?
Through that process, it's very difficult, as I say, to target the subsidies on particular products, but at the same time, it's also quite difficult to remove those subsidies too quickly, because then you would have an inflationary problem. So you have to try to wait until the level of inflation is lower across the board before you can start to remove subsidies on particular products. So that's one of the big challenges. The second challenge is which products that you're going to subsidize. That's also a problem because you can't exclude different people from buying it. Everybody can buy it. And then the third is whether it's actually targeting the right people. So the biggest problems with the subsidies is, number one, it doesn't target the right people. Number two, it's very expensive. And number three, it continues to distort the market. So one of the problems with subsidies is that it keeps the price down. But because the price is down, businesses don't want to supply at those prices. So then you have supply shortages. When you have supply shortages, it makes the price, puts pressure on the price to go up. And that's a big problem in subsidy reform. So it's a real challenge, actually. It's a really big challenge, but it's the most important thing, I think, that's on the agenda.
But do you think it's doable?
Yes, of course. With the right advice, it can be done. It can be done properly, but it's got to be done in a stable and a staged way. And people should expect to see that during the year. And that would be a sign of success, of the success of the policy, of the success of economic policy, if by the end of the year that's largely dealt with. That would be a good outcome for the year.
Very interesting. Now, we want to look at whether it's possible for the government to announce any tax cuts in the new 2023 budget. But before we do that, we're going to go for a quick commercial break.
Okay.
Don't go away, because Money Matters will be back shortly.
Kita mau memberikan mesej yang jelas bahawa belanjawan ini belanjawan yang mengambil kira kedudukan ekonomi yang mencabar sekarang, tetapi belanjawan yang boleh memacu pertumbuhan, meyakinkan pelabur dan dapat memberi rahmah kepada rakyat terbanyak. Ini suatu cabaran yang sangat rumit. Bagaimana kita boleh meyakini golongan kaya untuk melabur dan miskin untuk mendapatkan faedah. Kadang-kadang ada pertembungan situ. Ini saya selalu sebut pembenturan ideas dan dasar. Jadi ini perimbangan ini penting.
Thanks for staying with Money Matters. We're still speaking with Economist Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams. Now, Professor, for years, businesses have been calling for the government to trim the corporate tax rate down to 20%. Should these be considered in the new 2023 budget?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that there is a need to look at revenue, but revenue across the board. So that means that we shouldn't really be looking at particular taxes at the moment and changing them on an ad hoc basis. There needs to be a full reform of tax, a full reform of other revenue sources. So actually, it's true that government's revenue from taxes is relatively low in Malaysia in comparison to other countries, and that's because the rates are low, but also the collection isn't very good as well. So there is an issue we were talking about the spending side, but it's also the collection side has to be improved as well. And of course, the government also gets revenues from different sources like Petronas and royalties from the GLCs as well. So all of that, in my view, has to be reformed across the board collectively so that you get a much better mix. If you can get an improved and more efficient mix, then there is scope to make the tax cuts as the businesses want. And then, of course, you need to be targeting that on the smaller businesses so they get the benefit of lower taxes, whereas the bigger businesses that can afford to pay the taxes would have slightly higher rates. But overall, the tax rates should be lower. As a general rule, if you have lower tax rates, you often will get higher revenue because when taxes are high, whether you're a businessman or whether you're just a normal person, when taxes are high, people try to find ways of avoiding it.
Sure.
And that's a normal thing. It's not necessarily illegal. It's just avoidance. So when the taxes are high, you avoid it. When taxes are low, you're less inclined to avoid it. You're more likely to pay it, and the revenue will rise. But part as a whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned GLCs as one of the sources of income for the government. In your paper for ideas, you introduced this idea of responsible privatization involving GLCs. How do you think this can be addressed in the 2023 budget?
Well, the idea there was that my colleague Terence Gomez at the University of Malaya, who's now retired, but when he was there, he did a fantastic study of the GLCs, and he was more concerned about the governance of GLCs, which is extremely important. But one of the things he highlighted was how many subsidiaries the GLCs have. Very, very, very many. He calculated 68,000 subsidiaries. It's a huge number.
Mm-hmm. I also want to touch a little bit on the business environment in Malaysia. Malaysia was ranked 12th in the ease of doing business globally and 4th in Asia by the World Bank in 2019. Is this still the case today, considering the country's political situation right now?
Well, formally, it is. I mean, if these rankings are based on the infrastructure, how easy is it to set up a company? How long does it take to get a company registered?
And also political stability.
Yes, and also political stability. So, in that sense, formally, it is still very good to do business in Malaysia. But what we find when we speak to businesses, in fact, I just came from a business conference yesterday with the Chamber of Commerce, the French Chamber of Commerce, and there was a lot of discussion there about, yes, on paper it looks good, but actually, from time to time, many businesses feel that it's a little bit more difficult than it used to be. This is a question of efficiency in civil service. Now, switching to have much more online registration, switching to have much more e-government registration, which is something that YB Rafizi was talking about yesterday. He was saying that he's very keen on the digitalization of government. I think that will help to improve the ease of doing business here. But in terms of the political stability, well, your guess is as good as mine. I'm an economist. I'm not a political commentator. But it is important that we have a stable political environment for the next 5 years.
OK, political stability aside, how can Malaysia improve its business environment for both foreign and also domestic investors, in your opinion?
I think there has been a change in attitude. I've been here for 20 years, and I think that I was talking to many people yesterday who have also been here for quite a long time.
Because at one point, if I'm not mistaken, I think in the last 1 or 2 years, Malaysia was said to be losing out to its neighbouring peers in terms of attracting FDIs.
Yes, that's because these countries are opening up much more. Indonesia in particular, Vietnam, and also they're very much bigger. Indonesia is 9 times the size of Malaysia, and Vietnam is 3 times the size of Malaysia. So 20 years ago, Malaysia had a big advantage because it was very difficult to do business directly into Vietnam or into Indonesia, setting up companies there. And that's why Malaysia was a gateway to Vietnam and Indonesia and the whole of ASEAN.
Yeah.
But now they're opening up. Foreign investors will go there directly. They don't need to locate here. So the environment in Malaysia needs to be dynamic and change in response to that, because the overall business environment in ASEAN is opening up. Whether Malaysia changes or not, that's going to happen. So Malaysia needs to change and make what in my view the government needs to engage as closely as possible with businesses and ask them what they want and give it to them. Most of the time, these things are very small changes.
OK, we'll discuss more on that, Professor, but hold that thought for now, because we need to take a short commercial break right now. We'll have more on that, what to expect in the 2023 budget in just a moment. Don't go away.
Banyak hal yang kita ketinggalan. Hampir tiap hari saya ada kumpulan perbincangan hal ini, umpamanya dalam soal daya saing, soal kecepatan, kepesatan, kelulusan perniagaan, soal beberapa inisiatif atau ikhtiar baru seperti digitalization, beberapa tindakan untuk memastikan pengeluaran sumber asli itu melalui proses hiliran. Itu semua kita ketinggalan dari Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam umpamanya. Hal-hal ini kita mesti depani untuk memastikan kita mampu dan berdaya saing.
Welcome back to Money Matters. We're still speaking with Economist Professor Geoffrey Williams. Now, Professor, the country has racked up some 1.5 trillion ringgit in debt and liabilities. Can the government still afford a budget that wins the hearts of the rakyat this time around?
I think the answer is yes, but I think it will be a different type of budget. We have to remember that last year, the budget for 2022 as a whole was already a record level budget, 332 billion ringgit. So my advice would be to increase that in line with inflation. Core inflation is about 4%. That would be about 345 billion ringgit. So it would still be a little bit higher, but actually quite a lot higher. But that would give them ample room to continue to look at the priorities, in particular in social policy, healthcare, for example, education, and still with some of the subsidies which will still be necessary, but less. So that's a key element in terms of the spending. Many of the things that were prioritized last year and the year before have gone. So the COVID issue has eased. The question of subsidies will ease, particularly the petrol subsidies. So they will have more headroom in terms of spending, and then they can reallocate that in terms of priorities. A question of, as to whether people will be happy with it or not is a big question, because you have to remember that the budget we saw in October was right before the election. That's what it was designed for. It was a pre-election budget. So, of course, there's going to be a lot of handouts and a lot of goodies for everybody. That was the purpose of it. But now we're not in that position. This is not a pre-election budget, and so we won't, I don't expect that we will see a long list of goodies and handouts for everybody. So people need, I think, to moderate their expectations. They might be a bit disappointed if they're not getting a lot of presents at the end of the month. But if the Prime Minister deals with this issue of looking after people's income, helping them with the cost of living in a more structured way, it might not be goodies that he's handing out, but it's be better in terms of their income overall. How do you
think that's going to affect the Prime Minister's popularity among voters?
Well, if he were to hand out all manner of goodies, okay, on the one hand, you might expect that people will be happy with that. If he doesn't do that, you might say, well, people aren't going to be so happy with him. But this is not a time for him to worry too much about popularity. He's won the election, by the way, so he doesn't need to worry too much about that for the next 5 years. Now he needs to look at what's right for the economy. So it's not so much what's right for the rakyat or what's right for the business community, it's what's right for the economy. If he can put the economy into a much more stable situation, deal with the deficit, address the debt issue that you just mentioned, then that will give us more economic stability. And when we have economic stability, businesses can improve, and then employment can improve, and incomes can improve, and the cost of living should be able to improve.
Fantastic. Now, Professor, the nation is not having new sources of income, and its total debt is accounting for almost 65% of the country's GDP. On this note, let's take a listen to the World Bank.
Malaysia needs to put in place a set of rules on how to manage deficits and debts. Now, conceptually, reducing a deficit is straightforward. You reduce expenditures and you increase revenues. And it's not either or, you need to do both. And in the case of Malaysia, I think where we come out is that reducing expenditures, of course, is important, but increasing revenues, arguably even more so. Because, again, of the precipitous decline of revenues over the last 10 odd years. And again, I want to emphasize this is a point I think that has not been made much before. Malaysia wasn't in this situation 10 odd years back. 10 odd years back, Malaysia was in a medium revenue, medium spending equilibrium. Fast forward today, it's now in a low revenue, low spending equilibrium. And both spending and revenue is almost 30% lower than what it was 10 years back. And so if you focus only on expenditure without raising revenues, you're not going to get far. Of course, every ringgit saved is a ringgit earned, but you also need to mobilize more ringgits, because Malaysia's spending needs are only going to grow in the future, not shrink.
Professor, you've heard it. High debt situation, no new sources of income. How can the government address its fiscal deficit situation?
Actually, I wholly disagree with that perspective from the World Bank. I think it's completely incorrect.
That's interesting.
It's just wrong.
Okay.
You see, in terms of the debt issue, 65%, and actually the debt is below 65%, this is not actually high.
63, about.
Yes, it's about 63%. Yeah. So the limit is set at 65%, and it's lower than that. This is not actually particularly high in international terms. In fact, in Singapore, it's twice that. It's 130% of GDP in Singapore. There is an issue of the contingent liabilities. It's an additional, roughly an additional 15%. That's where you get this 80% debt level of 1.5 trillion.
Yeah.
And that's contingent liabilities. There is an issue there in terms of the risk and the stability of the contingent liabilities, but it's a separate issue to the overall debt.
Okay.
The big issue, I think, with the debt is that it's expensive. So the government is spending about 45 billion, which is about 15% of its spending just on financing the debt. That is, I agree, that is a problem. And there's not a great deal that can be done other than to reschedule the debt so that it's then on lower financing costs. But generally speaking, the debt level, in my view, is not an urgent issue. I think the Prime Minister was highlighting it in order to point out what we were speaking about before, which was if there was much less wastage, we wouldn't have to borrow so much. And that is one of the key ways in which you can address the need for additional debt, particularly in terms of deficit. If you can improve the wastage, both in terms of tax collection, improve the tax collection, and the wastage in terms of spending, then you can get more from what you have. More from your revenue, more from your spending. And it doesn't actually matter what we just heard about, Malaysia's a low revenue, low spending government. That doesn't matter at all. In fact, that's probably a better thing. It's much better to have less government in the economy than to have more government in the economy. And the reason, one of the big reasons for that, of course, is if you wanted to raise revenue in Malaysia in the current circumstances, the question would be, how do you do that? And the main solution would be GST. And GST is a tax on the poor. It's a very regressive tax. That's the whole point, because it's a tax on products and services that we all buy, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. And that's regressive. So it's important, as we mentioned before, to look at, we're talking about the business tax before. So it's important, I think, to look at taxes across the board and to improve the overall efficiency of taxes and to improve revenue across the board and to look at different sources of revenue. But that doesn't necessarily imply that you would, in the end, want to be increasing government spending.
Understood.
Increasing government revenue and increasing government spending, because that's a transfer out of the private sector into the government.
Right.
It's not new money. It doesn't come, out of the sky. They're taking money from you and from me and from businesses into the government, spending it on our behalf. And that's not necessarily the best way to have a competitive, agile economy.
Professor, we've come to the end of this program. Thank you so much once again for sharing your view with us on Money Matters, Professor. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure every time.
Thank you. For the past half an hour, you've been with us on Money Matters. Be sure to join us the same time next week with more money insights that matter. I'm Muhammed Ahmad Hamdan. Have a great weekend and take care.